everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, Accelerate Your Clinical Trial by Adopting a New Mindset. I'm Lisa Henderson, the Editorial Director of Applied Clinical Trials, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are pleased to bring you this webcast presented by Applied Clinical Trials and sponsored by ZS. I would like to share a statement from our sponsor. ZS is a professional services firm that works side by side with companies to help develop and deliver products that drive customer value and company results. The company leverages their deep industry expertise, leading-edge analytics, technology, and strategy to create solutions that work in the real world. With more than 35 years of experience and more than 7,000 ZSers in more than 25 offices worldwide, they are passionately committed to helping companies and their customers thrive. I'd now like to share a few announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we do encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. You can enlarge your slide window by clicking on the small square icon in the upper right-hand corner of the slide window, or by hovering your mouse over the lower right-hand corner and dragging the window to the desired size. Your slides will advance automatically during the event. If you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the question mark help widget in the dock at the bottom of your presentation window. I would now like to introduce today's speakers. We are pleased to be joined today by Chris Crabtree and Ben Thomas. Chris is the leader of ZS's R&D Excellence team in Europe. With 11 years of consulting experience at ZS, Chris focuses on the global headquarters of pharmaceutical companies in Europe. He has worked extensively in pipeline strategy, product development strategy, R&D strategy, clinical trial optimization, and real-world evidence. Ben is a consultant in ZS's R&D Excellence practice area. Over the last 7 years, he has worked with multiple pharmaceutical clients with a focus on the intersection between marketing, market access, and clinical development. Most recently, Ben's work has centered on the acceleration of enrollment through the application of marketing principles. So thank you for joining us today. And Chris, would you like to get us started?
Perfect. Thank you, Lisa. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Chris. I'm based in the London office of ZS, or ZS, as our American colleagues would like to say. So I'm very pleased to be talking to you today about this topic, which myself and Ben have been working on for quite some time. We're going to be talking about accelerating clinical trials. So partly, as the title suggests, through a different way of thinking about your trials, but importantly also through some very tangible and implementable ideas that you can take back to your teams after this webinar. So we're going to use some time today to talk through three sections. So firstly, we're going to introduce the problem we're working together to solve, and then introduce some concepts that might be new to you in this clinical setting, but also perhaps quite familiar to you from other walks of life. Second, I'm going to hand over to Ben to take you through some very tangible applications of these concepts in the form of ZS's trial launch catalyst offering. And then that's going to include a case study for some real-life example of how this has worked. Finally, we'll talk to you about how you might go about introducing these ideas into your day-to-day work. And of course, we'll have some time for questions at the end, so look forward to lots of good questions that we can help you answer at the end. All right. So to briefly set the scene, I think everyone on this call likely knows that the clinical development is a very time-consuming and expensive part of the drug development process. Getting much-needed new therapies to patients who need them as quickly and safely as possible has always been a key goal for the industry. Now, if we can accelerate the process, even by a matter of days, let alone months, it'll be hugely valuable in terms of costs saved and incremental revenues for the business, and importantly, in terms of benefit to patients. Now, a lot goes into the clinical development process, including designing the optimal study, selecting the right sites, managing ongoing risk, and successfully closing down and analyzing the data. But I think it's fair to say that the process of finding and enrolling patients is one of the biggest drivers of the timeline and one of the leading causes of delay. No matter how good our drug may be, if we can't successfully recruit and retain sufficient patients, we might reach the market late or not at all. So naturally, this is an area which deserves quite some scrutiny, and that's where we'll be focusing our time today. Now, the process of trial enrollment has always been a challenging one. Not only is it just generally an inefficient one, where we rely on sites and investigators to make it happen, but also there's several trends working against us. So firstly, the sheer number of active trials has been increasing. There's far more competition than ever before. You may have competition with other active studies that have overlapping patient populations. There's going to be competition with on-market therapeutic options. And of course, there's competition for the attentions and the resources of the sites and their personnel. So even if you think you have no direct competition for your trial, imagine the investigator who's busy caring for patients. He or she perhaps has several ongoing studies in other indications. Perhaps they're still trying to write up that journal article they're always trying to get to. And they'd even quite like to go home and see their kid. There's a lot of competition right there for their focus and for their attention. Added to this, protocols are becoming more complex for sites to understand and manage. We assume when we write our pretty lengthy study protocols that investigators have the same level of understanding as us. Yet, really, how likely is it that our investigator, when seeing an eligible patient that they're caring for that week, remembers everything about your study? How likely is it that a more simple to operate protocol comes to mind first? There's no surprise that we see such figures about sites failing to enroll patients, or even about whole studies failing to enroll altogether. And this is a major contributor to poor R&D productivity overall. So what are we going to do about it? At ZF, we see a big opportunity here. As we said, clinical trials exist in a competitive arena. Patients, investigators, study coordinators, even referring physicians, they're facing a decision to invest their time, energy, resources into a clinical trial. Many of these stakeholders will seek benefit from the participation. It could be financial, reputational, humanistic, but ultimately they have a choice to make between competing options that they face. Now, in a competitive arena, we believe it's something that we can learn from the commercial world. We can get some ideas from the commercial world. Now, in that world, it's perfectly natural to think about competition. When doing so, we start with the customer. Who are our customers? What are they looking for? How do they make decisions? What's important to them when they choose between different competing options? We then think about our product or our service and how it compares with the alternatives in the market. What is it that's different about our product or service? How are these differences beneficial for our customers? Finally, we help our customers or our stakeholders really understand our product or service and see how it addresses their needs. And we do that by engaging with them and communicating effectively. Now, let's take an example. Here's something pretty topical. If you're anything like me, COVID has not been that kind on my fitness regime. All right, I'm feeling a pretty pressing need to get some exercise. Now, I could consider three possible competing options for this example. I could go for a run. I could pay for a class, or I could push it off to tomorrow. I might weigh up the pros and cons of each option and consider such things as cost, effort, the expected results. Now, odds are I might well choose the third option, but I do have these things to consider. Now, many of you will make this same decision every day, but we're all different, and we all perceive the value of the different choices differently. But let's take the second option, pay for a class. There might be one group of people that take that option because they know it gives them motivation, that peer pressure that we all need to have a proper workout. Another group might be influenced by the social interaction and perceive value in perhaps the added advice that they might receive from the instructor. So if I'm running a fitness class and I'd like people to join, I can objectively understand the trade-offs versus these other options, but I also need to know how my different customers perceive value differently. Which means I can then better communicate the value of my class and even tailor what I say to different people. So So the option of pay for a class is the same, and how it's different from the other options is also pretty fixed. But if we understand that and we understand our customers, we can communicate different things to different people in a way that gets to the heart of how they make their decision. So how does this apply to clinical trials? Well, it's actually pretty similar. We first need to understand the decision makers. In this case, these may be the sites, their personnel, patients. And we need to segment them. We need to find these groups that have common needs or common ways in which they perceive value. We need to ensure these decision makers understand the element of value our trial provides and how it compares with their other options that they're faced. In the case of investigators and site personnel, we can typically engage directly. In the case of patients, typically we need to ensure that the investigators are communicating the value effectively to them. Now, on this foundation, we can have a strategy for effectively and appropriately engaging sites, patients, and other stakeholders, helping their decision-making with the most relevant information at the most relevant time. So that's a bit of an overview of some of the concepts. Hopefully that kind of resonates, makes sense. In this next section, Ben's going to talk you through how we can apply these concepts to your clinical trial and show you the impact it can have. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Chris, and hello, everybody. So from our experience, many of the concepts that Chris discussed are not considered fully today when it comes to the clinical trial space. So how do we convert the mindset that Chris has spoken about to tangible actions when planning and executing clinical trials? Well, this is where the trial launch catalyst comes in. We can think about the catalyst as a way to answer three key questions. Number one, just who exactly are our trial stakeholders? Where are they? What do they think? What motivates them? And how can we group them by similarity? And this is something that can be addressed through the processes of stakeholder mapping and segmentation. Number two, what do they truly value in our trial? What do PIs like about the intellectual property? How do referring physicians perceive the relative benefits of referring their patients to the study versus keeping them under their own care? What elements of the protocol do coordinators see as a barrier to entry? How do patients perceive the relative burden of the protocol versus other options? All of these are things that can be addressed through defining the value proposition and the positioning of the therapy and the protocol. Finally, number three, how do we best communicate with sites and patients? What are the best communication channels? Email, face-to-face meetings, conferences? When and how do we optimally get our messages across? This is something that can be addressed through the development of pre-planned engagement and channel strategy. What I'd like to do now is deep dive into each of these to show you what this could look like. Let's start with segmentation. Segmentation is simply the idea of grouping those with similar behaviors and attitudes and can be a powerful way to communicate with impact. There are many ways in which we could look to group trial stakeholders: past or current performance in trials, experience levels with similar types of trials or protocols, competition with other trials for time and resources, past or current levels of engagement with the sponsor or the CRO, or attitudes towards clinical research in general. The great thing about this is that much of the information can be derived from data used for site selection and feasibility processes. Indeed, at ZS, we look to use our own clinical trial feasibility optimizer to facilitate this type of segmentation. So how does a segmentation change the way in which we might engage with different types of sites? Let's take an example: experience levels. We know that there is always a spectrum of experience across any trial site list. What if we were to segment by experience based on the number of prior trials or expertise in the therapy area? If we did, what we would do is to adjust our strategy to have communication that reprioritizes time spent on education for experienced sites to focus on things like patient identification and outreach, whereas more inexperienced sites would receive a different flow of communication focused on upskilling them to master the protocol. Given the current world we live in, another very tangible segmentation is likely to be where a site sits in terms of impact of COVID. Indeed, we'd strongly advocate for segmenting sites by where they sit in their journey back to normality and adjusting the messages and the methods of communication accordingly to progress them along that journey back to normality. So that's segmentation. What about value proposition? It might sound strange, but we often suffer from the curse of our own knowledge. We know our trials inside out. We believe in the value of a new therapy, and we can list 100 different things that make it such a compelling proposition. Often, though, that enthusiasm and awareness does not pass to sites and patients. Indeed, our research with sites has shown that many are not able to clearly articulate what is valuable about the trials, even though they're running them at their site. This calls for a mechanism to empathize with what sites and patients find most valuable and ensure that this value proposition should tell the story of the study clearly, concisely, and compellingly. Indeed, this should be accompanied by an objection handler to help sponsors and or CROs overcome challenges that are raised when discussing the trial with stakeholders. Let's take an example here. We learned that a segment of PIs are not well aware of the mechanism of action of the drug and the potential promise it may hold. In this case, as you might see on the left, we want to develop messaging to proactively address this. For example, Product X has been designed to be the first therapy to target A inhibition without affecting target B, increasing the safe concentration of active substance in the body. As another example, let's imagine that a coordinator flags that patients are expressing a significant concern about the risk of placebo. In this case, we might want to have a message that helps to clarify those perceived risks. In trial Y, 80% of patients receive Product X for a year, and 20% of patients receive Product X for 9 months after 3 months on placebo. Prior research has shown no significant symptom decline whilst on placebo for this time. Fundamentally, we would advocate for the creation and rollout internally to all sponsor and CRO personnel and leveraging specific messages in external materials and presentations of a full value proposition for any intellectual property and protocol, which clearly details the potential value of subject enrollment and handles objections accordingly. So when it comes to segmentation and value proposition, from where do we get the driving insight? The approaches that we have discussed can only be truly addressed if we first develop a primary research-driven approach to better understand investigators, coordinators, and patients. Primary market research is the process of gathering new data from a set of respondents and can include things like qualitative interviews, quantitative surveying, and observational research. This research helps us to tailor what sites and patients value the most, to proactively address potential objections, and understand how best to segment. Here, we could systematically use this type of research during the trial design phase, testing a target trial protocol, not just with key opinion leaders, but also to gauge the perceptions of potential PIs, potential coordinators, and potential subjects before the first site has even been contacted about the study. Alternatively, research could be employed later if trial recruitment starts to run into trouble. I can imagine at this point you're probably asking the question, so then, does this actually have an impact? Is it really worth the time? If this is you, I'd like to show you just how much power a single insight can have. Zed has previously worked on a piece of research to understand why a trial was recruiting at a slow rate. The sponsor had thought the special tissue sampling process was a significant barrier to entry among elderly patients, and therefore taxing enrollment rate. However, the research shows something very different. In reality, the patients did not see this as a major barrier, but PIs and coordinators assumed that it would be. A change in the strategy to highlight this to sites, who at the time were being very selective and being very conservative in broaching the trial, led to a substantial increase in the recruitment rate, which you can see here. In this case, a single assumption among sites was a significant drag on recruitment rates. Primary market research won't always lead to a silver bullet like this, but it helps to prevent these types of situations from occurring in the first place and allows us to address the issues before they arise. Now, having a novel and effective strategy is all well and good, but if it's not implemented effectively, it will never realize its full potential. Our vision for the future of clinical operations would entail an engagement strategy which, 1, looks to capture key research insights and translates them into implications for the study. 2, plans the journey of a site through first contact to activation to study completion, mapping out all the interactions with the sponsor and the CRO along the way. 3, decides on the channel strategy, exactly how stakeholders will be contacted and how they can pull resources. 4, creates a detailed communication plan for direct face-to-face contact and indirect contact, such as email outreach. And 5, captures enrollment forecasts and thresholds that would trigger a plan for further data collection and further research to course-correct strategies once the process of activation has started. So, to recap, the mindset that Chris talked about really translates into 3 things: segmenting sites, crafting your value proposition, and implementing through an effective engagement strategy. We believe that this simple change in mindset, if applied, can lead to a substantial impact on getting products to patients faster, which is why we like to call it a catalyst. The byproduct, though, is that it also leads to stronger engagement with sites and subjects and more efficient processes with fewer amendments to the protocol. It seems like a mindset that we really should consider trying and testing out. And with that in mind, Chris, I'd like to pass over to you.
Great. Thanks, Ben. So hopefully that all made sense and got a little bit more tangible for you. Now, we've touched on quite a few ideas that might be quite new to you. So in this last section, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how you might embed some of these ideas into your organization. What are you actually going to do to make this happen? All right. So let's start with a very highly simplified overview of the clinical trial process, from design through to operational planning and then ongoing tracking. The first change that's required is in this design area. So many sponsors today put a lot of emphasis on scientific input from key opinion leaders in this design phase. We have ad boards, we run sessions with our leading investigators to really input into the protocol design. But this doesn't really help us understand how a protocol will be perceived by your typical sites and patients, your everyday investigators, perhaps not your KOL, but is often the one who's driving more of the enrollment process, more recruitment. So to create the foundation for what's to come, as Ben touched on earlier, we recommend a focused piece of primary market research with potential investigators, study coordinators, and patients to truly understand how the protocol is going to be perceived and how they would make decisions versus competing options. What do they like about the study? What are their concerns? What might prevent them from participating fully? This primary research allows us to define our value proposition. That is, what makes our trial attractive to these stakeholders. And it also helps us see how we're going to be positioned against competing options by different stakeholders. Now, the capability to conduct such primary market research may actually already exist within another function in your organization. This kind of work is pretty standard in the commercial world and in other functions like market access. So for here, it's really just about tailoring it to the clinical setting and, importantly, having the willingness to listen to the results and act upon them. Now, from this primary research foundation, we might also augment the results with secondary data and analytics to form our site segmentation, our investigator segmentation. So we use analytics and the research to define a relatively small number of groups of sites or investigators that have commonalities in terms of their experience, expertise, how they make decisions, how they might perceive the protocol. Now, for each segment, based on what we know about that segment, we will formulate our strategy. How are we going to engage? What are we going to say? When and how? Now, here the mindset shift is towards having a very clearly defined strategy at the outset, one that's tailored to each segment rather than a kind of one-size-fits-all approach or a sort of tactical, reactive kind of process. But I think also, importantly, there's going to be a capability shift here, not just a mindset shift, in the sense that any strategy, no matter how good it is only as good as our ability to implement against it. And in this case, that means we need to work closely with our CROs or our own in-field personnel like MSLs who are going to be the face of the sponsor to the trial. So if we develop a certain channel strategy or a certain means of communicating the right things at the right time, we need to make sure that can then be acted upon in the field or indirectly with the right sites at the right time. Finally, once a study is up and running, we might actually find there are new issues arise, and we might see under-enrollment again. Perhaps a new competing trial is launched, or there's been some new data on a molecule. Here again, what we would advocate for is not a reactive tactical response. There's a tendency to throw new recruitment tactics at the problem. Instead, we would really recommend going back to the foundation. So conduct a new focused piece of primary market research, understand the root cause of the problem, and then update the overall strategy and carry on. Now, we're realistic. Change can be pretty hard, and it makes sense to start small. So in terms of making this happen in your organization, we recommend, first of all, select a few trials where this is likely to be most impactful. So typically these would be your larger phase 2, perhaps phase 3 trials, where you anticipate lots of competition. Perhaps you're actually already anticipating that enrollment might be a challenging prospect. And perhaps you have a study team that's willing to try something new. They've got the mindset to move outside the status quo. Now, these concepts have also been applied to ongoing trials in rescue situations, which Ben touched on, but we'd actually recommend a prospective approach here to prove the value. So pick some trials that are upcoming. Next, run a proof of concept. So pick one or two of those studies, seek external help to apply these concepts if you need, and then robustly measure the impact. So think about a A/B test or test control kind of setup to really prove the impact of this effort. Now, importantly, this is something that's going to build your business case. So this is something to seek buy-in from the rest of the organization to go further and build this capability across trials. At the same time, so when you're running these proof of concepts, it's important to be assessing where you have internally your own gaps in capabilities. So what capabilities do you need to develop? Are they going to be from scratch? Are we going to be able to borrow them from elsewhere in the organization? And typically these are going to be centralized capabilities, perhaps in primary market research, data analytics, engagement strategy. But there may also be some capabilities you identify within your existing clinical operations teams or in your partner CROs where some aspects of training and upskilling might be appropriate. Finally, with these proof points in place, the business case to develop new capabilities is going to be a strong one. It's probably the topic of a whole different webinar to talk about then actually how you go about building the capabilities. But really as a starting point, to summarize, it starts small. Pick one or two studies where you think you can have the biggest impact and where something is needed. Use that to develop your proof points, assess your gaps, and make a plan to close those gaps going forward. Finally, I want to break this down even further. We'd like you to take at least one tangible action away from this webinar. I don't want this to be another one of those webinars that you forget about by tomorrow. So write something down. Everyone likes it to do this, right? Perhaps you feel ready to try out some of the concepts with an ongoing trial. Can you put yourself in the shoes of your sites and imagine how you'd make a decision to invest time in your study? Can you imagine a day in the life of one of your investigators? How many patients you see, how many studies you're involved in, how much competing information you receive on a daily basis. This kind of empathy exercise can be a very powerful one to do with your teams and can really help you kind of make that mindset shift. Or perhaps you could have a go at writing down the value proposition for your trial. Do it with your team. Perhaps invite a colleague from the marketing function to have a different opinion. But the process of actually writing down what is it about your trial that's different versus the others? What does that mean? What's the value that gives to patients or to sites or to investigators? Ultimately, we passionately believe this approach can accelerate clinical trials. With this, we can generate a lot of business impact, but importantly, we can bring medicines to patients more quickly. We'd love to have you try these out, and we'd love to help you turn these into practice. So with that, I'll hand back to Lisa to manage the questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that informative presentation. Audience, before we get started on the question and answer session, I would like to remind you how to submit your questions. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found on the right-hand side of your presentation window. And now we'll get started. Start with our first question is, you showed a case study earlier, which was impressive to see. Can you share any other examples of where your work has had this impact?
Sure. Yeah, I think I'd say what we're seeing as we apply this mindset to different trials and different contexts is there's a range of possible solutions that can come out that's quite broad. So in the case that we briefly shared, there were components of site selection and segmentation, as well as some quite rich primary market research with sites and patients. And in that example, we could see a very specific issue with the way the value proposition of the trial was being communicated to patients through ACPs. And that allowed us to really focus on rather a point solution and have quite a significant impact. I think what we're seeing in other examples is impact coming in different ways, different areas. So in some, what we're seeing is the process of doing a segmentation of sites and PIs has really allowed the sponsor to focus their efforts on a smaller number of sites that need the greatest touch and are going to give the greatest return on that effort, and also tailor the way they communicate to those different segments. In others, we've seen that the value proposition and really defining that has been central to improving the enrollment. So really understanding how you're going to cut through the competition and the noise around it and really position your trial effectively in the minds of the investigators and site personnel. And then in others, it's sometimes a range of small tweaks that come out through the primary market research that we do. So we might discover some very specific hurdles that investigators are facing, perhaps some miscommunication that we're picking up that we can quickly address. And so in each case, the range of solutions is quite different, but we're seeing impact in each case, and we're seeing improvement in enrollment of a range of 3x to 10x, depending on the context from the work we've done so far. I would say that the early work, and this is quite new, so we haven't done so many of these just yet. So the early work has been more on the kind of rescue context, so an ongoing trial that's under enrolling. I think what we'll see in the next months and into next year is more work in that prospective phase, so really kind of designing that in at the start. And so we expect to see more impact that way as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. Our next question, you briefly touched on the use of secondary data and analytics to support a segmentation of sites and investigators. Can you elaborate? What sort of data are you using and what kinds of analytics are involved?
Sure, yeah. I think, as a company, ZS is quite focused on applying data and advanced analytics to topics in this area, including site selection and segmentation. And so as a company, we've been pretty busy building a platform called the Clinical Design Center that supports that. And so at the core, what we're doing is we're bringing together a number of different data sets and mastering all of those data sets at the site, investigator, and study level. And so the kind of data that we bring into this would be things like patient landscape data. So that would be, what's the epidemiology at the country level or at the local level around the site, using real-world data to understand where the patients are. We bring in competitive intelligence data. So what are the competing studies, both direct competition with the patients and indirect in terms of taking up resources at a site. Where are those competing studies being run? And then things like at the site level, we've built a site registry and investigator registry that looks at past experience with similar studies, perhaps in similar therapy areas, therapy area expertise, as well as past enrollment performance. And then other things like country level data, for instance, what's the standard of care in a country? Are certain drugs approved that are relevant for this study? And so we're bringing all those together and applying analytics to kind of mastering it and coming up with the right kind of results for segmentation. But most of the case, what we see is people tend to start with a simpler segmentation. So, a combination of perhaps past experience at the site level combined with current enrollment performance, kind of matching those 2 by 2, and then that gives you a good place to start in terms of where to focus your efforts and the kind of engagement you might have with each site in each segment.
Great, thank you. Our next question. With site personnel, how do you ensure you are addressing different needs between small clinics and large hospitals?
I think that's really very much a continuation of the same topic. So, your segmentation could well factor in the nature of the site. And so it could be past experience. It could be whether it's a small clinic or a large hospital. And so in doing so, you want to design segments that you act differently against. So if for your study, the kind of engagement you need to have with a small clinic is very different to the kind you need to have with a large center, then that might be important to have in your segmentation. I think going forwards, what we would expect to see is more use of kind of attitudinal type segmentation. So instead of purely past experience and performance, we'd look at things like what are the motivators for that particular investigator or particular site. So referring back to the early example, the gym, different people are going to be motivated by different things. And so a segmentation that looks at this type of investigator are more motivated by communication around the science and the innovation and the MOA, and this other group are more motivated by the relative ease of the protocol or the burden to patients and these sorts of things. And those kind of attitudinal differences can sometimes be picked up in proxy form by the type of the site. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. And our next question. In the clinical setting, it's very important that we communicate with sites and patients in a very objective way, supported by data and evidence. How are you able to communicate a value proposition for a trial in this context? Is there a risk of becoming promotional?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's a sort of natural first reaction that we get from some people when first thinking about applying somewhat sort of commercial concepts in this setting. And firstly, I'd say it's really important to have in mind that what we're simply looking to do is emphasize features of the trial or the asset, the molecule that provides some differentiation from the competition. How we craft those messages absolutely needs to be in line with all the normal legal compliance processes. So it needs to be supported by data. It's really not promotional. Sometimes it's simply about refining the way you speak about your trial. In some cases, it might be about simplifying how you communicate things so that you cut through and get the message across. Sometimes it's about focusing on certain things like the MOA or aspects of the design that are most important to the audience in front of you, and that might be different for different segments. I think always it's about trying to get yourself in the shoes of the site personnel, really thinking about what information do they need to make their decisions, and not thinking, from your side, what do you think you need to deliver? Trying to be customer centric and get in the minds of the quote unquote customer and understand what helps them make their decisions. So absolutely, you need to make sure any messaging is appropriate and supported by data and appropriately signed off. But it doesn't stop you doing what you need to do in terms of communicating what's important about the study.
That's a really good point. You have to, educate them, but not use words that maybe sound promotional, like the question said. No, that's a really good point, though. Thank you. The next question, you describe the importance of primary market research and the different approaches used. We already use surveys and sometimes site visits during our feasibility process. How is what you're proposing any different?
Yeah, sure. I think in our experience, the feasibility process can be it can be rather open to biased responses from sites. Oftentimes they want to make it very clear that they are capable and willing to take on a study, and it tends not to get to so great a depth, and so it doesn't really give you the foundation that you need to do some of the work we were describing earlier. In our view, you kind of need the depth of an ad board combined with the breadth of the feasibility survey. So here you think about a couple of things we might recommend. So the first I'd say is you need to be thinking about engaging on a qualitative basis. So a survey will never get you much depth. You need to speak to people. And for that, it's really important to use experts in the field of customer insights. So these might be people already in your organization, or these might be external, but people who know how to craft a discussion guide and who have experienced moderators to get beneath the first layer of answers when you're engaging with sites. So that's the first thing. I think secondly, it's important to speak with investigators and study coordinators at a minimum. In some cases, it might also be important to speak with patients or caregivers or referring physicians, but they don't have to be on your study or in your site list. It's actually easier to recruit a representative sample anonymously from a broader pool, and then the advantage there, of course, is you don't get such biased answers as well. Now, clearly, if it's a rescue situation, you might typically just engage with your current sites. But if you're prospectively looking ahead, you can engage with any representative investigator or coordinator that can give you a good opinion on a protocol.
Okay, thank you. Our next question. I believe it was Ben who mentioned segmentation, value proposition, and engagement strategy as 3 key elements here. Which do you feel is most important, and what is the most effective or efficient way to identify potential factors for segmentation?
Sure. So I guess I didn't mention Ben. Unfortunately, couldn't stay on to the question, so you've just got Chris. Yeah. But yeah, it was Ben that mentioned those things. I think if you have to prioritize, the priority has to be on the value proposition. So this is really the core of your strategy. It's understanding what it is your trial offers, what are the features, benefits, if you like, and how does that compare with the competition? How is it differentiated from competing options that might be faced by sites and patients? And that really underpins everything else. After that, I turn to the engagement strategy. So if you've got your value proposition, but you're not effectively communicating it, then you're not going to achieve it. So it's engagement strategy is how you're going to communicate that value proposition, how you're going to engage sites in a very customer-centric way, with the right messages, at the right time, through the right channels. And really that builds on the core strategy. I mean, segmentation is sometimes a quick win, but I do think it's something if you had to prioritize, you could take that one off in favor of the other two.
Okay. And then our next question. Due to confidentiality restrictions, investigators might not be forthcoming about information about a competing study protocol that can give our study a competitive advantage. How can that be overcome?
In our experience, when you're working with a team to define the value proposition, define how your study is different from everything else that's out there, you can usually get a pretty good understanding of what's out there just from the public domain. So from clinicaltrials.gov or through the ad board or through your own competitive intelligence work that you might do. And it's not like you need to have the protocol of the competition, but you need to know the main aspects of it. So typically things like, the inclusion-exclusion criteria, sort of key aspects of the design. And we typically find that the clinical development team have a pretty good understanding already when they've designed their protocol, how it compares with what else is out there. So typically we're not needing to get anything too critical from speaking with investigators.
Okay, great. And then our next question, for an ongoing study, how do you address retrospective issues and educating sites on the ways in which you address something that was previously causing issues operationally?
Make sure I understand the question. I think if you have an ongoing study and you do some research to really understand what's going wrong and you identify some issues, if you can find a way to address those issues, like I said, if it's a quick win or something you can address through communication, then obviously do so. But sometimes the challenge is in helping the sites understand that you've addressed them. And one of the biggest challenges we see is that these site personnel literally have so much coming at them any one day, from their day jobs, from your trial, from competing trials, that it can be hard to cut through and really communicate effectively that you've addressed something, this is how you've addressed it, and get their understanding around that. And where we see to be most effective if you've got a close engagement. So if you've got people in the field, either in the CRO or part of the sponsor organization, who have good relationships, who have built relationships with the site over multiple studies, and really have the ear of the site. So you can really engage effectively in person and not rely on yet another email, even if it's a carefully crafted one. So I'm not sure I fully answered the question, but I definitely think it's important to have that close connection to a site. That has a big advantage over remote connections where possible.
Excellent. And then our next question: how do you perceive that limitations? How do you perceive that limitations on patient population impact your ability to implement the segmentation tools covered in this presentation, especially given the constraint of time to recruit patients in an accelerated environment?
So I guess I may interpret this wrong. I think there's two ways to read this. One, in terms of if you've got a study in a relatively rare condition with relatively few patients out there. I think that's one way of taking this. I mean, here, a segmentation, actually an important part of a segmentation for that kind of a study may well be that the relative epidemiology or the relative prevalence of patients around the site, or for instance the strength of connections with referring sites and how you foster those referrals in. So that might be an important aspect of a segmentation. If on the other hand you're thinking about a sort of a study in not such a rare condition, but you're finding it difficult to find the patients, perhaps they're underdiagnosed or they're not being channeled into the site. Then again, I think the segmentation tools still apply. You just have to think carefully about what are going to be the big drivers of how you act differently. So your segmentation needs to be focus on the things that you would do differently. So if you were to communicate differently or say different things to different segments, then that's an appropriate segmentation. You don't want to segment just for the sake of it, right? But in general, to the last part of the question, if there's a, if you're operating in an accelerated environment, which you almost always are, I think that really pays. It pays to do the work up front. So you should be doing your segmentation beforehand. You don't wait until you're in the market and everything's rushed and then it's a bit too late to do anything about it. So ideally, to the earlier point, you want to be doing this work for all of your important studies, but you want to be doing it before you activate your sites, before you get in the field, and then refreshing it afterwards rather than waiting till it's all a bit too late.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for fielding all those questions. You just gave a complete brain transfer for everyone from your knowledge base, so thank you so much. I want to thank the audience for attending and for participating in today's event, and I'd also like to thank our sponsor, ZS, for making today's educational webcast possible. You will receive an email alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay, and we invite you to forward that announcement to your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. We appreciate it, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.